Hello, welcome to Miss IJ's Kids Inclusive Podcast. My name is IJ Popoola, and you can call me IJ. I will be your host. On this podcast, we'll be talking about the stigma individuals with special needs face on a day-to-day basis on the continent of Africa. We'll be bringing to you professionals in the disability field, sharing resources and information that can benefit any educator, parent, caregiver, and community with persons with disabilities. Join me on this journey in spreading hope and resilience as we advocate for inclusive education on the beautiful continent of Africa. Did you know, as of 2018, 258 million children and youth were still out of school, and 3/4 of these children live in sub-Saharan Africa and Asia? Primary and secondary school completion rates are lower for children with disabilities than for children without disabilities. These gaps are much larger for secondary education completion, of which 1% of students with disabilities in Africa actually graduate. On today's show, Dr. Oliver Mutanga talked about the statistics on inclusive education in South Africa and Botswana, support for caregivers and families with special needs children, and the paradigm shift in viewing curriculums in African nations through the lenses of our colonial past. Thank you for joining us today, and we'll just go right into the questions, and you can tell us more about what you do and your research. So my very first question is, tell us a little bit about how you got involved with research in disability and education.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I really appreciate you approaching me. So with regards to the question, how I got involved in disability and higher education research, I think it dates back to 2012. Yeah, when I was doing my master's degree in South Africa at the University of the Free State. So I then applied to be a participant in an international winter school program that was focusing on human rights and development. So I was selected. So I went to South Africa. That was in, I think, around August 2012. So when I was there, then I think the course moderators for that program then asked me if I wanted to do a PhD, a funded PhD. Then I accepted, and they arranged for me to meet the director of the center, who became my PhD supervisor. So I had a meeting with her. She told me to apply, just to write a research proposal on what I wanted to do. But she was recruiting PhD students to do research on human development issues and in higher education. So I had no background in higher education. So when I joined there, I was struggling with the topic, to say, okay, what really am I going to research on? So my research proposal, my first research proposal that was accepted was looking at curriculum. But I think she noticed that I was struggling. So she gave me 2 weeks to say, okay, you know what, Oliver, I really want you to reflect on what you really want, because PhD is different from other educational levels that you have been, because it's a long-term career. So within those 2 weeks that I was given, I noticed that the major discussions that were going around at that university at that time were focused on race. I think it was because of
South Africa,
university, which was a former white Africans only speaking university, which was transiting to accepting Black students and Black staff at that time.
That's interesting. And what year was this?
Sorry?
What year?
It was in 2012.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. So I then said, let me research on something that is not being discussed at this university. And that's when I settled for students with disabilities.
No, that's amazing. It's interesting that you say that the issue of race in terms of the university that you were going to was still, I guess, very much present. I could say an issue. So you fell in love with the idea of disability at that time. So as we know, we have very few educators in the area of disability. How has it been for you, being that you have vast experience or lots of experience in education and disability awareness? How has it been in Zimbabwe and in South Africa in terms of having maybe special educators or people in the disability field? Because there are very few.
Yeah. I think you are right that I think if you look at Africa, there are very few special education educators and researchers. But I think for countries with a similar contexts like Zimbabwe and Botswana, the reason why there are few special education educators is that there are very few teacher training colleges that specialize in special education. So in Zimbabwe, there is only one college that specifically looks at special education issues. Then the other challenge is that for the few teachers and researchers who are trained, they leave their home countries for other African countries or for other, Western countries.
Western countries.
Because their skills, they are scarce skills, so they are easily absorbed in other countries. But these are all connected to a lack of seriousness on part of our governments when it comes to special education issues. Because the reason why the reason why I am now based in the UK, for example, is that there was no support home. If I go back to Zimbabwe at the moment, I might find a challenge to be absorbed in the system, whereas countries in the West, they know that we can contribute to the economy, so we can easily be absorbed. And I think the other issue that also contributes to a lack of special education in teachers in our countries is the global politics. We should not forget about the contributions of the global politics. And as an example, there is the issue of repayment of loans to the IMF and the World Bank, but what amazes me, or what I struggle to come into grips with is, for example, World Bank comes to Africa with their programs, the structural adjustment programs. They sell it to our leaders. They say it is going to improve the lives of the people. Our government takes that. It has never worked anyway, but still we are told to repay the loans. Whereas in actual fact, they should be compensating us for the mess that we are in at the moment, because they are the ones who created it. So I think they also play a very important role in that aspect. Then I think another contribution is a lack of that lack of special teachers, I think it reflects also on our societal attitudes towards disability.
Exactly.
Which, by the way, has nothing to do with us being Africans, but it also has its roots in the colonial projects because because of the, I think I will discuss further how it is linked to coloniality, but I think these are the reasons which I can tease out, which are linked to a lack of many special teachers in our continent.
Exactly. You make a very good point, and we will definitely further discuss it because it's part of your research when we talk about just the influences with our colonial past and how it's affected our education. And like we talked offline about that is how can we continue in a path of those colonial roots and expect success from our culture. You make a very good point, and I really want to get back to that. So my other question for you is, how is it for the student with disabilities in Zimbabwe, Botswana, and South Africa? Because those are where your professional career, that's where it was groomed and developed before you came to Europe. How is it for the student with disabilities? I can talk about Nigeria and I can talk about the United States, but you might have a different perspective of how it is in conjunction to the stigma that we experience.
Yeah, so I think the state of students with disabilities in Zimbabwe and South Africa, and I think and also Botswana, where I have actually stayed, is that a lot of them face challenges. Challenges, for example, like no reliable transport or no transport at all to go to school, no or a few assistive devices for those who need assistive devices. Then for some who use wheelchairs, they struggle with inaccessibility of buildings. And like we have discussed earlier on, few or no trained staff to teach those students. But let me just be clear that these experiences are varied. We don't have a uniform experiences either within a particular country or across countries. Although I think of all the three countries that I have talked about, I think South Africa tries to do a little bit more than the other two countries.
Okay.
So you would find that for some students with disabilities in these countries, there is no schooling at all. Some of them have never been to a school. Then there are some who attend only few grades, in primary school, then they just drop out. Then there are those who only attend primary level schooling. Then when it comes to high school, they drop out of school at the highest level in primary school. Then there are those others who go only for as far as the high school. Then we have those who attend throughout until university or colleges. Then they go on to the workplace. So these are different experiences. But you would find that at most, for those who attend, even those who attend only primary schooling, across the board, there is de facto inclusion. By de facto inclusion, I mean there are some adjustments here and there that are made available by their different institutions, but they are not coordinated.
Right.
For example, you would find that maybe a student with in a wheelchair is being able to study or to receive an education because of the goodwill of maybe local teachers, because of the goodwill of a certain lecturer, without it being institutionalized within different institutions. So that is one of the challenges that I found that students with disability face. And
So and just to not to cut you off, I'm hearing you say is that students might enroll in school, maybe in nursery, and for our listeners who are in a maybe in the Western world, it's kindergarten and elementary school, middle school. We call it nursery, primary, secondary, and then post-secondary. So for us, you're saying that students who might be enrolled in a primary school, those percentages of students with disability actually starts reducing the higher they go to secondary school or high school because of discouragement or lack of resources or no special education teachers. So by the time they get to high school, we have a few number of students with disabilities.
Yes. Okay. Actually, in South Africa, I think I was giving a talk again this week. The percentage for students with disabilities in higher education, it's 1% of the total percentage of students.
Wow.
And let me make another point again related to what you just said.
Please.
Yeah, that you have traced it well. That if we look at the enrollment rates from the primary or elementary schooling to higher education, it's like a filter. They are more at the beginning, then they become less and less. And going back to my earlier point that the global politics or Western institutions have a role to play. They also have a role to play in those numbers, in that they, especially the World Bank, they came up with what they were calling structural adjustment programs. And they disseminated education into different pieces. We have basic education or primary education or elementary education, which is different from higher education or secondary education. And when they came, they emphasized that the elementary or the basic education should be compulsory. They put it like it's more important for one to have basic education than
higher education. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And this creates a problem then, in that we then tend to focus on basic or elementary education is something that is important. Then when somebody has acquired that, we say it's fine. Whereas in reality, there is no separation between these levels of education, because elementary education is important as a basis for secondary education, which is also important and foundational for higher education, etc. So we should look at it as as a whole, not to separate as clusters. So I think that's where the institutions like the World Bank also played a role there.
Wow. That you make a very good point, in that what I'm hearing, I'm just going to regurgitate what you're saying so that people in maybe the Western world can really understand the context of how, I don't want to use the word underdeveloped, but we're definitely not where we need to be as a continent or nations in Africa, that part of the World Bank and the IMF and some of those institutions that came to Africa in the idea of trying to help have actually not made it better for us, because there's the emphasis on elementary school. However, how can you even encourage parents or a society to push for their students who want to aim for higher education to aim for more? Because the realistic thing is, we train our students with disabilities to know that we're training you and teaching you to live independent lives. But yet you have a lot of students who are still at that basic school mentality. So how can they function in society? Or how can they, for instance, how do we get them prepared to get jobs? Are we even dreaming, are we creating dreamers in a society so that someone with Down syndrome, someone with, cerebral palsy, someone who's autistic actually believes that they can function in society? And so you have a lot of, some people who have special needs and are probably mentally paralyzed in the sense of they don't believe that society actually is going to fight for them, believes in them, thinks that they are worth it, and they have something to contribute. So they are almost starting off at a deficit.
Yeah.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
Wow. So I'm saying this because some of my, my peers and professors, and when I talk about my thesis and I really explain how we have such a long way to go on the continent, it's almost hard to wrap your head around it. Like we are in the Western world, there's light, there's water, there's those things that any citizen can be confident in their government. And when you come home, you can come and relax, you can eat, but in most parts of the continent right now in Africa, we still have those basic needs issue. So when you now talk about disability, it just compounds the issue. It makes it even worse.
Exactly.
So, wow. Exactly. So my other question is, now I read your bio, and you are, I don't want to brag on you, but you're one of those Africans who have really is an example for so many people in education, with your experience and being well-traveled, in the European continent. Your voice really is a voice amongst your peers in this field, and I have to really brag about it, because this is Africa. This is one of ours. So with your being well-traveled and your knowledge, what would you think are some of the things that you've learned in the disability field that we can actually try to incorporate on the continent of Africa? Question for you.
Yeah, a very difficult question. But I think what I have learned across all the countries that I have been to is that there's something that is common, that is people with disabilities face a lot of challenges. But these challenges might differ because of different support systems around. And I think the West tries a lot in trying to support people with disabilities from the political side, as states. But I think I was impressed more by the Nordic region. I think by Nordic region, I mean Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, those countries. So they have a unique support system, which is tied to their culture and way of life. So, and they look at disability as a person-environment mismatch. So when they look at disability as a person-environment mismatch, they try a lot to do something to the environment so that people with disabilities can live comfortably and they can live independently. And they also look at disability as contextual, that is situational, that if you take, for example, somebody with a wheelchair user, he or she might be disabled in a specific location or environment and not in another environment. So they try to adjust according to a situation and according to a person. Then, which is also linked to them viewing disability as something that is relative, that it's dependent on many factors. So the way that they then provide for the needs of people with disabilities is just amazing. So that's what that is one thing that I learned. Then I also learned that from the Western world perspective, they focus much on state support systems. So it is the governments that do something for people with disabilities. Whereas in Africa, disability is more of a communitarian thing, or it is based on relations. So if in my family we have somebody who is disability, it's us as a whole family to do something about it, not necessarily the state. There are very few countries where state support is available. So
That makes a very good point, which also makes us understand why there is a lot of international aid that goes on the continent of Africa to support, things like disability and other things. But there's something you said about Norway, Finland. Did you say Sweden? I can't remember.
Yeah, they all have a very similar culture.
Yes, culture. I've always wondered about like Finland's education system, even outside of disabilities, but I know that's probably a conversation for another day. But I like what you said about how they view with disabilities in terms of their environment. It really just shows the amount of support that they're given. So my question is, as you said, we know that in parts of Africa, it's less of a state-supported thing, I guess, and it's more the family who supports. So what advice would you give parents or caregivers who are trying to advocate for their child or just a family member who has disabilities? Because it just seems like we don't get enough government support. So what advice would you give them? Because at the end of the day, we're trying to be dealers of hope and give people hope, because it can be very demoralizing in that sense.
Yes. So I think, first of all, I think there is something that is missed in Africa, that is available in Africa. That is, if you trace our history as Africans, pre-colonial, we had our cultures, we had our own ways of living.
Yeah.
And I think we talked about it in our last talk, that I'm looking, in my work now, I'm looking at the philosophy called Ubuntu. And Ubuntu is a pre-colonial ways of doing things that Africans were doing. And it values relations. It values living as a community, So my advice for parents who might want to, who are facing struggles with regards to their children getting education, is to go to the basics of talking with one voice, engage at local levels, form grassroots movements, advocate for some change to our political leaders. Because one thing that I might be wrong, but I think one thing that I believe is that Africa is so rich that we are not poor as some might claim. We don't need anybody's aid. What is only lacking in Africa is our political priorities. Because given the resources that we have in Africa, if we were using them in the right manner, they will be self-sufficient. We will be supporting these programs that we are talking about. So I don't buy this talk that, we are not doing ABC for people with disabilities because of lack of funds, of lack of resources. We have the resources, but it's how we utilize them.
Yes. Oh, that you made a very good point. I like what you said about really starting at the grassroots level. It's one of those things that most Western worlds, and with policies that have been made and developed, it all started because a group of people said we need change in this area, and we're not going to move until we have change in this area. And I think that's what we need to do for our students with disabilities, because back to your expertise, is we're talking about those students, the 1% who actually make it to the end of the finish line at school. What hope do they have in, let's say, getting a job or getting prepared? Do you have any maybe advice in your specialty for that students, that 1% group of students with disabilities who make it to graduation from secondary school? What options could they have? Because I work with an organization, it's called Green Onyx Foundation, and we try to work with some students or just individuals and adults who have disabilities but have not been able to gain employment because nobody wants to hire them, or there are no accommodations, like you said, no transportation, no ramps, no rails, nothing that will be able to meet their needs as a society. Do you have anything that you can say to speak to those students who've graduated and are just looking for a job?
Yes, so I think for those who have already graduated and are looking for a job, I would say congratulations, because I know from my research and my work that they are a very tiny minority, and for them to reach that stage, they would have encountered many, many, many challenges. So because I think they have already shown their resilience, and I would encourage them to keep fighting in their job search in whatever fields they might want to pursue. But if they fail to get those promising jobs that they were aspiring for, because they have already shown tenacity and resilience, they should not lose hope. I think they should diversify and look for other opportunities, maybe in different fields from the ones they have been trained for. Maybe to start some self-employment initiatives. So that's the message that I'll give for those who have already graduated. But because they are already they are entering a very tricky job market, which one they might face discrimination because of their disabilities, and also it might be because of something that is not related to their disabilities at all. For example, that the market is already saturated with graduates who are struggling to find employment. So
Point.
the long-lasting solution there might be an overhaul of the whole curriculum change. To have curricula which looks at specific context, that is context specific. And this will help in creating opportunities for graduates because they will be having something to give back to societies and communities, and it can be very useful, unlike situations where we have these curriculums that we adopted from the colonialists, which were tailored to make us, if you get employment, servants or second-class employment status and etc. So I think the long-lasting solution for African students, be it those with disabilities or those without disabilities, is for national governments to change their curriculum.
Wow. And on that note, my very last, very important question that I am absolutely interested in is your new research in collaborating with other your peers and colleagues from Africa on articles and really looking at the decolonization of our education system in all post-colonial states on the continent of Africa. I really want to hear your thoughts on that, and maybe it's a good segue to another show. But I would like to hear your thoughts on that, because the spirit of change that's happening globally, a lot of it is tied to the colonial era and how many people and societies and cultures are trying to break away from that mentality. So I would love to hear your perspective on it in the area of our beloved continent.
Thank you so much. Yes. So I'm working on 2 projects with colleagues in Africa because from our informal talks, we started to question a lot of things, that we were used to, that we didn't, what we now find of no value, of questionable status. For example, I think earlier on you asked me about the issue of stigma associated with disabilities. So with stigma, the way that we are now collaborating with my other colleagues will be to really explore the issue of stigma. So if the meaning of stigma is a mark of disgrace, we would then say, okay, let's see. A lot of people have written about stigma associated with disabilities in Africa, and they try to paint a gloomy picture about Africa. Is that the reality? So we will then step back and say, okay, let's look at the reality. So we would then say, with regards to stigma associated with disabilities in Africa, we would then say, okay, if stigma is defined as a mark of disgrace, do we have evidence that African communities are treating people with disabilities with that mark? We step back. So let me just touch on stigma before I go to my current projects.
Sure, no, please.
Yeah. So we will then look at the history of African communities. Then we find that, communities, different communities, Africa was not uniform and is not uniform. So different communities in Africa were treating people differently. In some communities, twins and people with living with albino were treated like with respect as having special powers, whilst in some communities they were killed. That's what was happening in African communities. But if you also look in the West, around the same time, I think the West was even brutal and stigmatized people with disability. If you look at the eugenic period, you know the eugenic period?
A little bit, but please, I'm listening.
Yeah. So they were trying to come up with, some elimination of undesirable human traits or an elimination of undesirable humans. So they would say, okay, people with disabilities, we don't want those kind of people. So they would kill them. If you look at the Jews' experience under Nazis, it all fell under the eugenic period, that you look at as a certain group of people and you say these are not human beings as we want to define them.
The rejects of society.
Yeah. So on that aspect, you would find that historically, the West has been at the forefront of stigmatization and brutal of other human beings. So if I look at Africa currently, with the definition of stigma, I would say maybe there is very low stigma associated with disabilities. And if it's there, it's very subtle. You know, if we compare with maybe being in a prison or having HIVs, those are stigmatized.
Yes.
But with disabilities, it's different. I think what exists in Africa around disability is that we misunderstand disabilities a lot. We don't have an understanding of many different types of disabilities. And then this leads us to stereotyping some types of disabilities.
Right.
So if I go to Nigeria, then I find a family hiding their child with a disability and not sending him or her to school.
Yes.
If I look at that with a Western lens or a Western theories, I will be quick to conclude that there's stigmatization. Whereas if you look at it from the African perspective, you'll find that maybe this family is actually struggling to take care of their loved one.
Yes.
They want him or her to go to school. Maybe they actually have been to a school, but the teachers might say, with the condition that your child has, surely there is very little that we can do to help him or her.
So, I have a question to ask, and you can continue. So, what you're saying is that historically, the era that you called it, and I'm going to do research because I like to learn new things.
Yeah.
Historically, if you look at the Western world, people with disabilities have either been killed off, rejected, that almost the origins of the word stigma really started in the West because they were never accepted. But if you look from the African context, I don't want to say that, most Africans have a sense of empathy for one another, but it's more of a lack of understanding of what this is. If that is okay, which still happens today because most families don't even they don't have a name attached to it. They just see the manifestations, I'm guessing, of the disability. They don't know what to call it, and so in our in our knowledge, it's not that they don't want to help, they just don't understand what it is, depending on where they're located. So how can we then call that stigma if there's lack of understanding in the first place?
Okay. Yeah. And they want to help, but they don't know how best to help.
Yes, they don't have the resources. That's a very good point.
Yeah. So you'd find that that's a context that is not fully unpegged.
Yes. So you still have to keep digging. Wow.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So then the second point regarding stigma in Africa is that if you look at the worldview of most African societies, it's tied to our cultures. I'm not sure of Nigeria, but in Zimbabwe, there is this belief of in avenging spirits, especially if one kills another person.
Oh, yes. Oh, no, that's part of as well my research in that the area of disabilities, like you said, a child who is albino, has a fairer or has no pigmentation and is light. Culturally, sometimes they may not understand that. And there are cultures where they think that they're special, or they might use them for, let's at least be open. I want this podcast to be an open experience. Really use them for sacrifices in that sense, because of our context of looking at something different, so that's a very good point. I wrote that in one of my papers, and my classmates and my professors were like, really? I said, yes, this is a very true. Sometimes in some parts of regions in Africa still practicing that. I think they call it like the spirit of the witch child or something like that. So
yeah. So whether it's right or wrong, but that's the worldview of some communities and societies in our continent. Wow. And so this belief in avenging spirits, especially when one kills another person, they are then tied to the belief that these spirits cause different challenges if they are not appeased.
Yes.
And a disability within the family might be one of these challenges that comes out of that spirit. So if that's the case, then a family with a child with disability might then try to hide a child,
for protection.
For protection. And they are not stigmatized. They are not hiding the child because the community is stigmatizing the child, or they're afraid of the communities stigmatizing the child, but them being stigmatized is the causes of this spirit which is now attacking the child.
And we are going to have to hopefully come back and have another conversation about this, because I really want to touch on the students or the children with disabilities seen as the witch child. And that's a whole different episode, but I do think, we should bring that to light. And to wrap up everything, Dr. Mutanga, it has absolutely been a pleasure speaking with you. You're obviously someone who knows what he's talking about, not just from reading and experience, but you come across as a person who really has made so much changes in terms of how we think about disability. And it's such an honor for me, because I know that it's a very, this field, even worldwide, you don't have enough special education teachers. You don't have enough people talking about this issue. So when I see one of us, an African who has really made great strides in research and goes all over the world to educate people on disabilities in Africa. I think that's something that should be honored. If I had a Nobel Peace Prize, I would give it to you. Maybe we'll create our own in disability field. But thank you, Dr. Mutanga, for joining us on this podcast. It was absolutely a pleasure.
You're welcome. Thank you so much for the invitation.
After a great conversation with Dr. Mutanga, I asked him, if I were to come to Zimbabwe, where would you recommend I go and what food would you recommend I eat? And he said the traditional millet zadza, which is fufu, with green vegetables and free-range chicken. And he also recommended the Great Victoria Falls. Thanks for listening to Miss IJ's Kids Inclusive Podcast this week. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do so on our website at www.IJPopoola.com. Or if you want to write to us about topics you would love to hear covered on the show, the email address is popoloijelma@gmail.com, one word. And if you'd like to follow us on our social media pages, it's at Miss IJ's Kids. I am IJ Popoola, and you've listened to Miss IJ's Kids Inclusive Podcast.